But in the past few days, something was added to the game which hasn't been noticed by that many people yet, and that was Sandor's weapon has been added into the weapon list tab. And through this, we can see his base weapon and his weapon at 4-star, and pretty much from the way the effect changes, know what the 1, 2, and 3-star effects of this weapon will be also. So Sandor, in recent times, whilst belonging to a very popular synergy and bleed, has fell out of favor a little bit because the most maximized bleed lineup has tended to have been Sonara, Rhea, John, Daeron, and Night King for those top accounts. And of course, this weapon is going to have to be very good to push any of them out. Realistically, it will have to be Night King, which gets shifted out of that fight. So the question I'm going to ask in this video is pretty much, is Sandor with his weapon going to be good enough to actually accomplish that? So I have here everything mapped out. It's going to be a lot of theory crafted numbers and whatnot in this, going over how much damage he's going to provide at every interval. But as far as the effect changes his awakening ability will get, it should be what is listed here. This is a pretty common pattern that we've seen with recent weapon releases, where we see the only change from base 4-star to base weapon here being an additional target in the column directly in front of Sandor being targeted by his effect. So there's no change to the normal attack triggers, no change to the damage, and then from base weapon to 4-star weapon, he will trigger this in only 25 normal attacks rather than 40, and it'll gain another additional enemy in this column to a total of 3. So I can pretty much guarantee this is what it's going to be. This is quite common. It's with like John weapon, for example. He has damage reduction on the first tier, damage reduction on the 4th tier, and then all the intervals in between are crit percentages. And when you see similar progressions, this is more than likely what it will end up being. So before I get into the very mathy part of this, going over how much damage this is going to actually increase his awakening effect by, there is something very important to note with this, and that is what I've written out here. So I have double checked this with a Chinese native speaker who's checked the game in Chinese, and apparently the tooltip for both Sandor's weapon effect here and Marjorie's weapon effect is the exact same, and it's just translated a little bit differently. And the reason that's very relevant here is, maybe it'll be easier if I show this in game actually. If I go to my most recent UT report, Napo one, I use this to get a report screenshot in here just as an example. But if we look here, what you might assume gaining an additional target or 2 on Sandor's effect would do here is, instead of just hitting the enemy in front, which would just be here, A5, so this is all that would get hit by Sandor in this situation, you might assume that if you gained a second target, it would then hit, say, A4, and if you gained a third target, it would hit A3. What this will actually do, if it's the same as how Marjorie and her weapon works, which is the same tooltip, is an additional enemy in the column would, rather than just hitting A5 here, it would also hit B5 and C5. The issue of this, obviously, is in this scenario where I only have infantry, the additional targets would effectively do nothing. So it has its pros and cons, because if you are hitting into multiple troop types, in a similar note to if you're running something like Cersei Daenerys into someone's castle in PvP, that's really good historically, because Daenerys' dragon attack and Cersei's wildfire hits all lineups, and that ends up doing hugely increased damage, because typically you only have defense and health stats primarily on your front line. So if you hit into this second row and this third row, and they have troops with lower defense stats, you'll get more kills through that. So if you're attacking someone's castle and you have Sandor's weapon, and you end up hitting into the second and third row on this column, you could end up doing hugely increased damage, even beyond just obviously the additional targets of this 550% attack and the bleed, because those damage sources may do inflated damage as well as having additional hits as well. But if you are hitting into mono and you have the weapon at 4-star, effectively the only thing you should be getting benefits from in that situation will be these reduced normal attacks required to actually trigger this effect. So I have here a chart going over all the damage and comparing down here the differences between them in terms of total damage. Because of that, when going over this, this is all mapped out from the average normal attack values from Sonara's weapon at 4 stars. So all of this is just the amount of normal attacks on a infantry rebel group, I believe, with infantry itself, and then multiplied up by the formula for Sonara's weapon at 4-star. So it can be lower than what's listed here, it can be higher, but this is what it will be on average. And when reading into this, again, note that this is best case scenario where you're hitting into 3 targets on the same column with every proc, which probably isn't very realistic. If you do end up hitting into that, though, you can see that the damage ceiling of Sandor's weapon at 4-star is absolutely ridiculous, honestly. This is the theoretical equivalent of an additional 270 full damage normal attacks, which is fairly absurd, and I had to double check my maths because it just sounded too high, but this is what it came out to be. This is obviously very premium whale stuff we're dealing with here, but this as a damage source is honestly in a vacuum fairly unmatched by anything if you get full value out of this. So I would be very worried about being soloed as a mid-spender by a max bleed account at this point, because this plus Daeron, if you have mixed troop types, you are going to get absolutely melted. So with 4-star Sonara weapon, you will, from the reductions to the triggers here, gain 5 additional Sandor procs, and those procs obviously can also hit multiple lineups in the same column if there are lineups to target. One thing you might question if you're going to be fairly quizzical about this is why the bleed coefficients here are effectively scaled off 100% damage coefficient rather than 550. So when I was looking into this video and researching it a bit, I was report analyzing, and you can see here Sandor Clegane used the Warsoul Awakening skill, dealing at 21k infantry damage to ally. So bleed here should then do 20% of this over 5 seconds. 20% of this would be a bit over 4k. This is also from that aforementioned Napo report, so he'll have all the bleed buffs, like the dragon skill and whatnot too. But if you look down here, the bleed number is nowhere close to that, and I believe in this situation there was already a bleed on this lineup through Rhea, and this stacked with it. So it seems that Sandor's bleed that he applies is only scaling off 100% of the troop attack rather than his own 550%. I didn't know that going in, but that does appear to be the case. So when I first saw this weapon be released, I saw this column thing, and my initial impression was, it's going to be a bit like Marjorie's weapon, where it reads really well, but people don't realize that column semantics, it's actually worse than it reads. But even with just the trigger reductions, it is a huge damage increase. And even if you hit into like 2 targets for half the fight or something, the height of your damage output just increases by such a ridiculous amount. Like, this is effectively, in the best case scenario, multiplying Sandor's damage output from what we have currently today by 5 times, which is ridiculous, realistically. And to my initial question of this video, I do think that fairly comfortably pushes Night King out of the maxed bleed lineup, if you're not caring for the casualty rate, obviously. So something like AC, where it isn't as relevant, then in terms of damage output, this is just totally on another level. And in that context of AC, things like soloing castles, and by that I mean buildings that the other alliance is holding if they have mixed troop types in there, and you have Dea on Sandor, the AoE damage you're going to be getting from this is pretty ridiculous. I think it outscales females' AoE damage now. It isn't as snowbally if you're hitting into people weaker than you, where you can just nuke them really early and then coast on the numbers advantages. But you do need some time to get going. But across a full 40 seconds, if you can survive that, yeah, the AoE damage is just absolutely absurd. Yeah, that is Sandor's weapon. I do think this will be somewhat meta changing in that max account bleed does get stronger through this. But on the same note as that, obviously, if that's the case, then Cav female in response to that will also be in a decent position. So maybe with both those things simultaneously, not much would change. There will be ripple effects because having so much damage coming from skill sources, it will mitigate the reliance on normal attacks. So these top bleed accounts won't be affected as badly by disarm effects from female and whatnot. And it may change how things play out because of that.